All right, so welcome back into the metaverse. Today, we're going to be diving into a game project that really is one that is kind of from the OG side of things. And what I mean by that, there really isn't any OG Web3 games out there yet. But what we have is games, companies that are being built based on a lot of what's happened in the history of gaming overall. We're going to dive into that a little deeper. My name is Paul Barron. Welcome back to Metaverse Insider. Joining me today is, of course, Mark Otero, who is with Azra Games. He is the CEO over there. And if you don't know Mark, a little bit about him, Mark Otero, CEO of Azra Games. He's also the former general manager of EA Capital Games, GM of Bioware Sacramento, and the CEO and co-founder of the highly successful gaming startup KlickNation, which was, of course, acquired by Electronic Arts. So been in the business for a long time, Mark. So first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be on the show, Paul.
Excellent. So, Mark, let's learn about Azra and kind of just a little bit of what you're trying to do. Because you come from kind of old school gaming. You come from the real history of when gaming was born, I feel like, modern day gaming at least. And when you get into Web3, things kind of change a little bit. Tell me about where Azra's going. What's your mission there?
Yes, so it's interesting that I'm considered OG. That's funny. When I started making commercial games at KlickNation, I started there as a game designer. We're just two people, and at the time, Facebook Canvas, was blowing up with a bunch of games, so browser-based games,
Right.
and free to play was just beginning to be born, especially here in the Western markets. In the Asian markets, it was already taken off. And so it's interesting because at that time, free to play was, something that was frowned upon at the time by other OG developers. And so it's interesting to come back again to see the cycle kind of repeat itself. And, even though I started designing commercial games in the free to play space, I'm a long-term dungeon master. I started playing Dungeon Dragons in the second grade, became a dungeon master, for BattleTech, for Dungeon Dragons, and that's where I fell in love with role playing games.
I like the fact that, when you look at game development right now, at least in blockchain, one of the things that we talk about a lot here on the show with a ton of different game companies is this transition from, the true Web 2 game universe to what will be a Web 3 game universe in the next, decade. What we will see when we look back on this in 10 years is this is the genesis point for really how a lot of these game companies are going to be birthed, and also the kind of game style that we're going to be seeing. When you think about that and what you guys are doing, obviously your background in the number of games, successful games that you've already created in the current game ecosystems out there, when you start to transition that into Web3, and you think about economies, even though economies are kind of built into current games already, but now we're talking about real value. These are NFTs,
Yeah.
or in some cases tokens, various models in which economies are being built. How much of an importance is that in game development today, as much as you've done in the past on more about just having fun?
You know, I've seen this transition twice before. And so when we made browser-based games, there was at the time, Facebook, the main mechanic of Facebook, at least for the Generation 1 developers, was this concept of virality. And
Mhm.
so nearly all the games and all the funds and institutional funds really double down on apps that had tremendous virality. But as you know, that type of virality was very weak because the users didn't stick around from the virality. And a lot of the users that came to your apps weren't necessarily the users who were going to use your apps long term. And so there was this incredible focus first on kind of the technical opportunity and that Facebook allowed virality to happen. However, what ended up happening on Facebook, the games that ended up really, I think, creating a very sustaining audience as well as the economies were those games that were deeply engaging. They were fun to play by the users, and it went down a more traditional route of creating games. And then you have mobile. And I remember when mobile came out, the breakthrough at the time that everybody was talking about was, God, you got to focus on the touch screen. That was the breakthrough. And so you had games like Cut the Rope, you had great games like Angry Birds that came out. But if you look today at the top grossing games, They're not in the top grossing charts. What ended up happening was the mobile phone breakthrough really was about the convenience of having access to entertainment, really wherever you were. And so the
Right.
games that ended up evolving and embracing that were the ones that stood the test of time. And so when we look at blockchain, I see the same evolution again. And so when people think of the blockchain, they think of tokens, they think of NFTs. And so the focus is specifically, I believe, on the wrong things. Instead, because I've seen the wrong things on Facebook, I've seen the wrong things on mobile. And so the first thing we did when we came to this space was first take stock of what's going on. What
Hmm.
is the technology? What does it enable? But don't make the game about that. Instead, focus on a game that's going to engage, retain, and use the unique properties that can make the game stronger for the user experience. Because I know that approach has a higher chance of standing the test of time.
Yeah, I would agree. I think in the sense that we're starting to see that prove its case, because obviously we've seen the evolution of what Axie Infinity and Sky Mavis has done very successfully. They've kind of
Absolutely.
created that play and earn space. And there's been a lot of people that have, had a knock on Axie Infinity. The game wasn't, strategic enough. There wasn't enough there. And then you've had games like Illuvium, games like Star Atlas. You've got, you name it. And we've had them on this show. The game element itself seems to be accelerating in terms of the fun environment of really creating great games. My question is, when you look at teams that are building in the ecosystem that we've got right now in Web3, a lot of these teams have not built. I mean, sure, there's been some AAA gaming studios that have converted, not necessarily fully, but you've got things like Jam City who started to do some stuff with Champions Ascension. There's some different variations of it. We just had My Neighbor Alice on, which is a different studio in Europe that's doing a Web3 fairly good game. But in most cases, they don't have that star-studded team that has kind of gone through the trials and tribs of game development. I was looking at your list. So you've got Noriega, who is a game director from Star Wars Galaxy. You've got Neil Upade, which is your VP of Creative, also Star Wars and Apex Legends. Then more Star Wars guys. It seems like, and then Mass Effect is in here. Anthem is in here. EA Capital Games. It looks like you've got a whole roster of guys and people that they've been down this road before. Is that something that you think the Web3, you know, current community really needs to be able to leap forward in blockchain gaming and how it might look in the next few years?
The first thing I would say is that, having built and released 8 collectible RPG games, it is extraordinarily difficult to make a successful game. There's a reason why I have personally released 8 of them in a row. And it's because making games are difficult. And so, with each game, it introduces new complexities and new challenges, as well as, when we talk innovation, we're really talking risk. We're really talking about the trade off. And so when we put the team together, when I co-founded KlickNation and designed the 2 successful games that would eventually get us acquired, which were 2 RPG games, but very different RPG games. Most of the studio is made up of people that I've worked with for years. And so this isn't a studio, even though it's new, it isn't necessarily a studio that needs to gel. So we've
Right.
all worked together, most of us. And the reason why that's important is when you're creating a new studio, generally speaking, the first 1 or 2 games, or even the third games, generally don't do so well because the team needs time to gel. The team needs time to know how to work with each other. The team needs time to define what quality means and the type of games that they're going to build. And so there's a lot of things that needs to happen for a team to gel. Now, when that moment happens, within the studio when that happens. And that's when the magic starts happening because you're getting the best from everyone. And when you
Right.
get the best from everyone, there's really no ego. You know what I mean? You go to the best person who creates the best character art. You go to the best person who creates the best looking sword. You go to the strongest game designer who's incredible, perhaps about creating incredible battle systems. You go to someone who's a technical artist who's really good about combining the engineering as well as the art team into one, so that you can do things that that would be very difficult to do if you didn't have that glue and that connection. So I guess what I'm saying is the first wave of games, in my opinion, I could be wrong. I think they're going to have a really tough time.
Yeah.
They're going to have a tough time. For one, the team is going to need time to gel, and hopefully they have the runway to do that. Two, they're going to learn a lot. They're
Yeah,
going to
for
learn a
sure.
lot about what they did, as well as what the competition is doing as well too. And so once again, when you look at these things, and you look at them, from and you zoom out, and this is what I mean that games are really, really difficult. And so when we decided to have a reunion of the studio again, we're located less than a mile from my original studio that I co-founded. And so it became KlickNation, then Bioware, then eventually became EA Capital Games. So it's been renamed twice. And some people went off to different studios to learn new skills, and so, but we're all coming back together again for this grand adventure. And we're all bringing new ideas, new skills, but we've all worked together already.
I think that, you're right. I think a lot of times what we find in, whether you grew up in Silicon Valley and saw the gel, you're kind of talking about of how companies and developers work together, much like what developers do with, what we've seen in Silicon Valley of really some of the power companies that come out there. Gaming is quite a bit different. Obviously, there's much more creative talent, and you've got to have that team, continuity. I think that's very important on building. The component I'm looking at is when you look at Project Arcanas, what you guys are developing now. How would this, for based on what Azra is doing, explain where this would kind of play into in the existing landscape, but maybe also in the future landscape of blockchain gaming? Where would Arcanas fall?
So, I always like to provide context because then it provides clarity in answering your question. And so one of the things that I've noticed with new platforms is there's this obsessive passion, especially for new game teams, to really copy. So they can copy 90% or they can copy 100% and then
Hmm.
reskin. And so that is a natural tendency for new teams or for very junior designers, because it's a safe approach because you're copying
Yeah.
someone else's playbook. And so, we're obviously not a new team, even though we're a new studio. But there was this one thing that I really have always wanted to solve, and we tried solving this in Star Wars. We tried solving this in Heroes of Dragon Age, but we weren't able to pull it off. And that was this fantasy, and it truly is the inspiration for our game. And so we got together and said, what did we all do growing up? Why is collectibles, so popular? When people think about Star Wars, they often think of the movies. But I'll share with you some data where it shows where the real Star Wars fantasy lives. And that's with the player. And here's why. When you take a look at the movies, they made a lot of money, but the toys themselves have made up over 50% of all lifetime revenues for Star Wars franchise. And so that says a number of things. But the biggest thing that stands out is that when you give the player tools, when you give them these figurines, which they enable and facilitate fantasies and replay value. This is why toys are so popular and so powerful, because they're mechanisms for storytelling. And so where I'm going with this, and in terms of the inspiration for our game, we wanted to do something that was, in our opinion, extremely difficult to pull off. How do when you were young, when you were 7 or 8, 9 years old, you had a toy box. We all did. Some toy boxes were larger than others, but in there you had broken toys. You had some toys that were burned. You had big toys. You had dinosaurs. You had Transformers. You had He-Man and G.I. Joe. And here's the thing. You didn't make rules where He-Man can only play with He-Man and Giants can only play with Giants. Instead, what
Yeah.
you did was you created these impossible battle situations and then you put them all to test. And that was the replay value of fun. And so we go, okay. We know how to make party-based RPG games. We
Mhm.
know how to make collectible RPG games. And however, for this game, we have a huge innovation budget. We're going to prototype until we can capture that childhood fantasy of combining your big toys with your little toys in a way that
Yeah.
was balanced, in a way that's fast paced, and in a way that's fun. And so that was our inspiration. Why was that our inspiration? Because we can all relate with it. And it's
Sure.
so powerful. And we said, we're going to do something so familiar, but so unique because we know there's going to be a lot of noise out there. We know there's going to be a lot of copycats out there. We want nothing to do with that. Instead, we're going to build our own way. And so
So
that
okay,
was really the
so
inspiration of Project Arcanas.
yeah, I think that is one that's refreshing. I think in the sense of us seeing where this is going in the future, because I think to your point, you're dead on in the sense that what we're seeing a lot right now with blockchain is a little bit of skin recovery. It's game after game that are player based card games or rotation based games, which unfortunately I think that's just the low hanging fruit of the industry overall. And I think to your point, there's going to be some big opportunities in Web3 to really kind of break out and create those IPs that may live on for the next 3, 4 decades, much like what we saw in the early stage of gaming, in traditional gaming today. With that being the
Yes.
case, is there any area, that you see in terms of whether it's a genre or a category that you think will be the breakout, area of Web3 versus what we've seen so far? I mean, so far we haven't seen really a pure fantasy game really break out. There's a handful that are pretty close to release, at least off of alpha, but nothing that's really broken out yet. What are your thoughts on what category or what genre area might be the potential catalyst for growth?
So, it's really, really difficult to forecast that. It's exceptionally hard. But what I can say, when you take a look at the mobile space and the free to play marketplace, about a third of all top line gross revenue, comes from a collectibles RPG like game. And so I think immediately it validates that, we were all storytellers of toys, when we were
Yeah.
young. And for many of us, including me, we're still storytellers of toys. And so I think the fantasy of role playing through your toys and creating impossible matchups is something that will stand the test of time because it's something that even I have two sons and I have a 6-year-old and he still plays with his toys. And so that tells me that this fantasy is still very strong and alive. And so for us, we don't see so much and look at the market and say this genre is going to do well. Instead, we ask ourselves, is this fantasy still powerful? Is there a desire for this fantasy? And how can we deliver that fantasy in a way that's just epic? And so we hold ourselves to that expectation. And so that's how we define quality. And so for us, we're thinking for us is we're going to create the category based upon this new experience that we're introducing. In addition to that, as you've gone through our team list, because we're having the opportunity to create this new experience, it also provides us this opportunity to create an IP that people can label and say, yes, I played Project Arcanas. I
Right.
played this game. And here's what I felt. As an adult, I'm now time splicing and
Mhm.
revisiting my childhood fantasies. And for us, this is why we hired an extremely strong lore team. We have Kathleen who worked on a number of titles for Bioware for 13 years, just incredibly talented. And then we have Neil who's worked on the largest IP at EA, because we wanted powerful storytellers to help craft a world and a universe and a franchise, a forever franchise that's unique for the times, that's accessible at the same time. So it's both accessible and unique. And so, we have gone through a variety of different concepts. We're already on our sixth iteration of our battle experience gameplay, our sixth one. And I think we're finally about to land that. And we'll have something very, very interesting to show, hopefully towards the end of this year, with in game
Mhm.
footage of what we're trying to create in capturing the fantasy.
Interesting. I think,
And
when to your point, I do think that creation around, because we've seen a little bit of this in a handful of projects that we've talked to here in the last, 6 months or so, which seems to be a ramp up of a lot of the beta releases and even some of the alphas here recently that have shown fairly. I would say Illuvium might be the one, at least on my book, that would say they're far enough along because they're doing some interesting things. We've been able to play the game. There's some elements there. There isn't necessarily that tie into what I believe is that decade-long IP or potential multi-decade IP, much like what you guys did with Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes. That's a forever game. That's a game that's going to be there, obviously, because of the IP and the relationship to the franchise, obviously. But when you get into crypto, I think this is going to be a time in which this is where I think some really interesting champions are going to be born right now in the next few years. So you guys are, I think, are in the right place at the right time. Explain to me PFPs, because these are a little different than PFPs like most people hear us talk about. Player forever passes. Explain that, because
Mhm.
that's a little bit different angle.
Yeah, so when we were so first of all, let me just I have a philosophy, and the studio has a philosophy is, we generally don't believe in mini games as a strategy. One of the things that I've seen out there is there's a lot of mini games out there where,
Mm,
when you're building a game, the last thing you want is another mini game that appears to be incongruent with your main product. And
right.
so, however, to do that right, you have to have a lot of discipline, you have to be patient, and you really have to invest in the architecture and make key decisions around that architecture. And
Mhm.
so, when we started designing our game, and it's been an iterative process, a destructive and a creative process, we really wanted to give the community, first of all, we wanted to build a community. We wanted to get to know our community and really hear what their thoughts were. So as we're crafting these PFPs, which are these NFTs, these are really explorers. It's kind of like if you imagine yourself going to Disneyland and you have a ticket, you get to ride all these crazy rides there at Disneyland or Disney World. And so we very much see our PFPs as kind of that ticket into our Disneyland park that we're building with you. And so these PFPs, fictionalized, they're effectively explorers, who visit our game and who can visit different games. And they have functional capabilities and facilities that only they can do. And so we see them as explorers into our world and an opportunity for us to grow our community and to get to know our community. And they're going to be explorers that can visit each one of our games. And so
Yeah.
as we're building our game stack and tech stack, we're thinking very, very long term, 5 to 10 years. And we really see these explorers as being a part of that journey with us for every game.
Very cool. I think that's going to be. It's also a little different of a style in which gameplay could eventually evolve, especially for Web3. All right. So when you guys sat down at Azra, you thought, okay, like we're we've come from traditional gaming community. We're kind of trying to bridge this gap into Web3 and moving into metaverse and NFTs and really kind of the evolution of next gen. You think about that and you look at some of the direction that we're hearing. I mean, I just read an article from Davos, just where they had, and they were really, I was surprised that they were talking so much about metaverse. And it
Mm.
really surprised me in the sense that they even brought it up. But they really focused in on all these different iterations of how metaverse might be utilized in workforce and medical and all that. Gaming wasn't necessarily, entertainment was included, but gaming wasn't necessarily targeted. Obviously, they're looking more, socioeconomic. But my point is, do you think for the gaming world, because remember, gaming has not had a metaverse before now. Do you think a metaverse is even needed for blockchain gaming to truly succeed in the next decade?
No, I don't.
All right.
And the reason why I say that is because, I think anytime there's a general consensus of what something should be, that just tells me that whatever is going to happen is going to be very different and it's going to surprise us. Like no one
Yeah.
expected Facebook to become Facebook, right? Everyone thought it was going to be Friendster, then MySpace. And then suddenly Facebook came out and it ended up dominating the social networks. And so, if you were to go back into that point of time when Facebook began to dominate and you would rewind 2 or 3 years before that, no one would have said they're the leader and no one would have said this is what social networks look like. So I'm
Hmm.
extremely skeptical when people believe they have the answer and they can future cast this is the metaverse. Because quite frankly, I'm not even sure what a metaverse is. You know, is it a room you go into? Is it a world that you explore? Like, what exactly is a metaverse? Is it NFTs that you get to create the metaverse in your head, and the NFTs are effectively the tools that you use and say, hey, I'm a part of this metaverse. You know what I mean? I'm a part of this cool club. But most of that metaverse could exist in your head, and that you have these NFTs that are essentially expressions of that metaverse. And so I do not even know what a metaverse is. For us, the way we're approaching it, for us, we think about the crypto market, we study it, we understand it, we try to understand it culturally, the language, the people, their desires and aspirations. We're just now wrapping our head around that. Even though we've collected, we've traded NFTs, we all have tokens, we all have multiple wallets. For us, we're still going through a process of discovery.
Hmm.
And as
Yeah.
through this process of discovery, the one thing that we're really anchored on that I can really count on is once again is we all have this fantasy of toys, of playing with a lot of different toys. And for us, we're going to leverage the capabilities of the blockchain to allow people to amplify that experience. For me, that's way more concrete than trying to predict, in 10 years what the metaverse is going to look like and whether or not the metaverse is necessary for the blockchain to succeed. Because quite frankly, the blockchain's already evolving. NFTs have
Right.
already been successful. And so these things are here. I mean, if you have a certain NFTs, you could be a part of a certain Telegram channel. Is that a metaverse?
Hmm.
Maybe. And
Yeah, I
so
think to your point is there's been a lot of people speculating that maybe the metaverse has already arrived. Is that we've just created these communities that are kind of starting to inbound on themselves. That the idea of what Meta or Ready Player One kind of vision might be, it could not necessarily be that for quite some time because I still argue the point of whether or not AR VR is going to be real for any
yeah.
near future opportunity. I still think we're quite some time away of really seeing that, obviously with mass adoption and getting into, applications in which it might be used. So I would agree to a certain extent, but at the same time, I feel like what we're creating is kind of that new element of whatever we want to call it, Web 3, Internet 3.0, metaverse, wherever it lands. The point is that there's going to be a lot of new ways to interface with entertainment, among many other industries, even like what I mentioned there at Davos. When you think about that and the opportunity that lays in front of everyone really for Web3, because this is, for me, it feels like I was developing in Silicon Valley in the late 90s when the dot bomb boom
Mhm.
hit. So I got a chance to see that kind of a little too close and too personal. But I kind of feel like that's where we are right now with Web3. We've got so much going on in the space. A lot of it is frivolous, and then there's a handful of projects that look like, these could really be something big. And there's projects that haven't even been born yet. so so when you think about that, do you think we're going to see traditional gaming studios jump into this sooner or later?
So I was around in the 90s as well too. So now I'm revealing my age. So I actually helped raise $2 million for a startup back then. I came at the tail end, just just as it was imploding, and so I remember that time. And personally, I thought, well, I didn't know it at the time. That was a very healthy period of time because what it did was the capital ended up washing away some of the frivolous ideas.
Yeah.
And what it did was it ended up supporting some of the strong ideas, and it gave them an opportunity to kind of escape the noise. And
Yeah.
so I see that here in the crypto space too. There's still a tremendous amount of capital. I think it's almost every 2 weeks we hear a new fund or they raise their second or third or fourth fund.
Oh
That's
yeah, for
great.
sure.
because we're going to need this capital to innovate. And
Yeah.
so, there's going to be plenty of cash and check writing probably for the next 1 to 2 years.
Hmm.
And so I think it's going to take time, for some strong projects to rise above the noise. And it may take longer than we think because of so much noise and everyone screaming for your attention.
Hmm.
I think it's going to be really, really tough. And so you really have to do something very special. You have to do something incredibly unique that's evocative, that engages you and retains you for the long term. So, in other words,
Yeah.
you have to really put the time in to do something accessible, but also something very creatively unique.
Yeah, and to your point, in the late '90s, early 2000s, obviously we didn't have social media that really was the new megaphone for what's happening in crypto right now. We talk about it quite a bit here. Obviously, we use it, even with our own, power index where we track a lot of projects and so on. But you're right, it wasn't in that era, it was much harder to get the news out. Now you've got so much information coming at the world
Yeah,
that it's difficult to even know who the winners and the losers really are until we start to
right.
see some real projects start to struggle and fail. And then the other ones, the real cream rising to the top. So it's just like any other market, I believe, is that we're going to see the winners. We're definitely going to see the losers. Which brings me to my last direct area of questions, and that is the tech itself, because right now there's some struggle with, I would say, I would argue, the largest IP in NFTs today being ApeCoin. And Ape in general. When you look at what Labs is doing, it's kind of interesting in the sense that they are trying to right now figure out the best traction for them from an NFT side of things. They've got this thing going
Yeah,
with both Polygon, IMX, Avalanche, or ETH. All of this is kind of a struggle right now as to whether or not it can actually even house an IP like that. So, and this is
yeah,
still a very small IP compared to something like Star Wars. So,
yeah.
with all of that happening, what blockchain are you guys going to use for how Azra is going to be built?
So, I realize I didn't answer your first question. So, can I answer that about the studios?
Sure. Yeah, please do. I
So,
thought you were just
I'm complete.
sidestepping me.
No, I'm completely speculating. So let me preface that right now.
Okay.
Uh, having worked for a large gaming company, it was a great experience for me. Um, you know, they move at a certain pace and they move at a certain speed. And however, when they do make a decision, they're incredibly fast. And so my take on these larger companies is one, they have the capital to be patient, to see what happens when some of the noise dies down.
Yeah.
That's one. Two, they also have the capital to then come in and acquire that knowledge, that talent, and that IP. And so if I were to speculate, those two things are going to happen in that order. So they're going to be
Coming
patient,
fast.
and they're
Yeah.
going to acquire, then they're going to accelerate.
Yeah. Yeah. So the big boys are coming. All right. So back to my original question, and that is blockchain direction. How are you guys going to handle the framework? Because obviously, right now, there's a lot of challenges in a variety of different chains today.
So I think at a very high level, you have the EVM and its chains and ecosystem. And then you have other platforms like Wax and Solana, that have their own technology and programming language for smart contracts. And so
Right.
for us, the way we think about it at a very high level is, we think of the EVM, we think of Solana, and we don't know which one, in 2 to 5 years is going to become,
Hmm.
the dominant chain or the dominant ecosystem. And so we have to pre-plan right now to abstract some of that layer away, and think architecturally of how we can eventually respond to change and be positioned appropriately. And
Yeah.
so I do not have a favorite chain. Now, some of the team members may disagree. They do have their favorites. I personally
Hmm.
don't. Instead, I think of it as, the EVM and really the Solana. I think those two are the largest, with EVM being clearly the largest. And so we're taking that approach of building technology that allows us to respond. And so when we do, announce our choices, we really also to announce the architecture and our thought process and approach.
Yeah.
We're not, we're a multi-game studio. We're going to continue to release, unique RPG experiences. But we're thinking very much long term and setting the company up from multi-chain perspective, which long story short basically means we're investing a lot of time, just like in our IP, in our gameplay. We're investing the time necessary to invest in our technology.
I think that's a good approach because you're right. We are so infant right now in the stage in which a lot of this is being done, mainly because we haven't really seen any kind of pressure from mass adoption. What we've seen is some congestion in many of the chains like Solana. You could compare Wax and what we've had, William Quigley on our show many times talking about Wax and the evolution, their whole rollout. You look at the EVM compatible layer around Ethereum, lots of dApps, lots of developer infrastructure that's building over there. And I think to your point, we don't know yet who is going to be the winner. And there's probably going to be a ton of battles, back and forth here over the next few years, especially as we start to see the IPs ramp up. Because the IPs are starting to get a little bit ground underneath them. I would say Ape is, and you look at Larva, what they're doing is just, I think overall, they have the potential, but there's going to be a handful of projects right behind them, whether you look at something like, Kevin Rose with Moonbirds, or you look at what Gary Vee is doing. They're not even game
Mhm,
developers. That's just NFTs. But the fact
mhm.
is they've got these massive IPs and these large audiences that will eventually
Yep.
fold in on this. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see how all this connects because it's all going to be needed for the game layer, which is going to be
Yeah.
super, super critical.
I think ultimately content is what's going to drive the adoption. It's not the other way around. I think there'll be one or two really breakout
Yeah.
mainstream enough where it'll kick off a certain kind of momentum that'll feed on
Hmm.
itself. But really, I think the investment in content, this is probably one of the reasons why you're seeing so many, game funds raise hundreds of millions of dollars,
For
because
sure.
many people see games as really the killer application, the bridge, to the mainstream market.
Yeah.
And I tend to agree with that, conveniently because we're game makers. But I think content is ultimately going to drive the winner.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do. And we talk about that a lot on the show is that it is the IP makers right now that will force the hands of the developers to come up with the solutions that are needed to really make this, work in the next era. And I always reference it back to the early stages of the internet, is when e-commerce started rolling out. Most of the time it broke every other second until
Yep.
the developers started making SSL and true layers of security to be able to enable it because they were forced
Right.
to, because the adoption curve was coming so fast from the population that the need was just there. So definitely cool stuff. Hey, listen, Mark, we're going to be looking very closely at Azra as you guys roll out on your game development there. So we'd love to have you back on the show as you guys get closer to getting something live in the market. But thanks so much for stopping in on the show today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you very much, everyone, for having me.
You bet. All right. So you guys are tuned in over on the podcast side of things right now. Make sure and jump over here to the YouTube channel because this is where you're going to catch all the great graphics. A lot of our breakdowns when we do more technical analysis on gaming, blockchain gaming, NFTs, etc. Make sure and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure like a few videos. It's going to give you a feed and it's going to help us understand what you guys want to watch and listen to here overall on the network. Of course, if you want to reach me, it's out there on Twitter at Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on Metaverse Insider.